Hi, we are recording. This is a KnownUnknown podcast. And what we're trying to do with this particular podcast is really sort of get under the belt, under the brains, under the hood of some amazing creatives out there doing things that maybe are not part of our usual day. So today, my guest is Stig, and he's going to kind of, take us on a bit of a journey in terms of what he's doing in his world. From being a creative and a professor in the kind of coding kind of space, and we'll unpack all that. So welcome, Steve. Thanks for joining us on this little podcast.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Looking forward to our chat.
Great. Well, let's start with the usual quick introduction. Just give us that sort of tweetable version of your journey so far, just so our listeners and viewers can understand how you've got to where you are today.
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess it started back in the late 1980s. Yes, I'm that old. When I bought actually an Amiga 500 as my first computer. And I played around with that as a teenager, not playing games, unlike what most of my friends who visited me wanted to do, but I thought it was interesting to code and to paint and to dabble with this rather limited hardware and to see what I could get out of it. Quickly had a little encounter with the demo scene. That took me to pursue my interest of mixing graphic design with digital media. I ended up in a print agency that later had to switch gears in the middle of my apprenticeship from being actually more print focused into looking into this new and wonderful thing called the internet. And so I ended up in various agencies. As a new media designer, doing CD-ROM kiosk-based stuff. And then from that, later on, I pursued a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and then a PhD on computational graphic design, which is actually what I'm teaching now as an associate professor at the Danish School of Media and Journalism.
That's great. Yeah, there's a few words there that you're using that take me back a little bit as well in terms of, new media, when all that kind of early emerging technology was landing into design studios as this kind of as this new tool in the late 80s, 90s, whenever, around about the internet. So great. I think we've got a lot in common. So I think one thing that I don't know if you can you see me this number? Does this number mean anything to you, Steve?
420 come together.
Yeah. I'll hide the definition of what that is for a second, but it has various meanings. But I didn't know if that, being someone who's interested in code would know what that was.
Is it like Brian Eno?
Well, I think there's a couple of things you would not know. There's a beer in my part of the world called Sweetwater 420, and it's also, I think, a number when people get busted over here for marijuana. But this is actually the timeline or the length of a Beatle track come together. So by design, I'm not sure, by the Beatles back then, but it's an interesting, and so that leads me to my first creative question. If there was a fantastic song, it could be Beatles, it could be anything that an iconic song that the world knows. Is it even possible to somehow use the lyrics, if you were teaching your class right now, take the lyrics from that iconic song and through code in some way create the poster, create the image, the key image that represents the story of that song? Is that even possible in your world or not?
Yeah, absolutely. I would consider most of the world that's surrounding us to be quantifiable in some sense. The sounds, the smells, the colors, even like temperatures. It's like sweltering hot in Denmark right now. So I know this may actually, at least in my experience, offend some of my students because they have some sort of like a more romanticized view of the world as being this wonderful magical place that we're in. And as soon as I start like breaking it down to its like components and talking about quantifying stuff to be able to feed it in as some input into a generative code sketch, for example, on one hand, it's like fantastic, it's amazing, it's awesome. And on the other hand, it's sort of like, okay, some people feel like it's detracting from their previous encounter with this particular song or lyric or poem or whatever. But I think we've seen many great cases where lyrics, as you're referring to, has been treated as text that is a bunch of strings of characters that can be represented with a number. So if you don't want to do a big semantic analysis of the content of the lyrics, but just treat it as a series of strings and characters. Well, definitely, absolutely. It's the easiest thing to do, to just make a visualization based on rules that you define of that particular song.
Because I think, and that's really interesting, because I think a lot of traditional designers, of which, I would count myself in that group, kind of, I wouldn't say there's a fear for there's kind of world of code design and using code as part of the creative process, but I think it's probably a lack of understanding. And how you've just sort of outlined that in terms of information, being lyrics or something else, something to do with the weather, can all be somehow translated. Let me just, I have a call coming in, so My next question is really, if you were walking down the street or you're in a car and you're walking somewhere and you see a great poster that you have not designed, not part of your school, not part of your world, but you're just looking at something you think, wow, I really like that. And we're assuming that poster has been somewhat designed in a traditional manner. Do you ever look at something that may have come from a more traditional world and sort of break it down in your own mind to think if you were to recreate that, not in a plagiarism way, just in a sort of process way, how do you think about how you could create that similar image using code versus a more traditional technique?
Yeah, constantly. And it's so annoying because I think in a way that, I've been ruined by my job and the perspective that it has given me on the world that I live in, looking at things constantly. And, this visual bombardment that we see on a daily basis at the moment, like we open our eyes from our good night's sleep, we're bombarded with stuff. And I can't help looking at all of these things that I look at during the day. And if I see something that I can instantly recognize as being something that has an underlying systematic approach, a particular aesthetic that I can see, oh, that originates from a Perlin noise pattern, or like any code-based approach, really, I instantly just want to, drop whatever I'm doing and just, get hunched over the keyboard and start typing away. Because it's, I wouldn't go as far as to consider myself the Neo of Matrix and looking at design in this like green characters and a black background kind of way. But in a sense, yes, I often see things that I can think this is going to be so useful as a teaching aid, as this like hashtag object to think with that I'm using for a particular case of showcasing a particular algorithm, a particular design method, a particular designer as well. Some of the things that I've recreated, there are these iconic designers from way back when that had sort of like a similar mindset. They were also fascinated of systems, mathematics, and stuff. And even though they had to do things by hand, most likely, back in the 50s and 60s, they still followed this or adhered to this underlying system very rigorously. And nowadays, like half a century later, I can sort of like tap into the way that they thought of what they were doing and sort of like take their logic and just formalize it in the form of code and run that. And I find that immensely intriguing, exciting, wonderful to play with. So Um, yes, I'm.
It
Yeah,
leads me to a sort of a second part. I had another question, but what you've just said there. So if you were to teach, let's call it the no computer challenge. So knowing that you are a teacher, but I am assuming you're not teaching young kids in kindergarten. But imagine if you had to teach kindergarten children for one day. Coding concepts, but all you had was paper, scissors, magic marker pens, Sharpie pens. How might you go about that? To a group of obviously students, but at a slightly younger level, but without the technology that maybe how picking up on that analog comment that you just mentioned there regarding some of those classic designers. Is that even possible?
yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right that I'm not teaching kindergarten children, but I think it's an interesting question nonetheless. I've been lately very interested in sort of like even abandoning papers and scissors and sharpies in favor of perhaps like sort of like getting an understanding through bodily interaction. I saw some really famous video clips. I think it was like, I can't remember if it was John Maida, I think it was, um, who very famously tried to like recreate the sort of like inner workings of a computer through like humans playing particular roles in part of this. Like one is a CPU, one is a bus, one is a memory chip. And the way that they try to recreate a simple task, handing over small nodes, the CPU has to run to address the memory that has to store this and then later on give it to somebody else who's requesting it. I found that really interesting. And I think probably if I would have to teach coding concepts to kindergarten children, um, I would probably now be interested in looking into how can you embody this? How can you bodily recreate uh, this way that the computer or the code is working? But of course, not limited to kindergarten students. I think that the students that I teach, usually in their early mid 20s, um, and I think I see no reason why they shouldn't also be up for the challenge of trying to like recreate a simple processing sketch or P5 sketch through a like a little, not cosplay, but then a little a little fun reenactment of how it works. I think really the way that you learn is also through doing things with your body. Of course, listening, seeing, but also doing things with your hands, with your body. I really, myself, is a strong believer that um, paper and pen is not something we should abandon just because we have the computer. And I know processing has really named the programs that they're doing with as sketches, referring to this like old analog thing of making things in small doodles in a sketchbook, a physical sketchbook. Um, but I think just because we have a digital sketchbook in the form of coding environments, we should still very much try to use pen and paper, drawing, sketching, analyzing, because I think if you do that, also by using your hands and your eyes and coordination, you'll learn a lot better than just by watching or listening.
I think you're answering a couple of questions there. One other question, and maybe was for your students, it's almost like it's okay, meaning it's okay to try this, do this way, experiment. I also come from an era back in the 90s with ATTIK where we were experimenting consistently, albeit in the print world. Inks, finishes, papers, of course, graphic design, typography. But I just think that level of that permission, in a way, to screw up or fail was always there. And it sounds like from your students, the way that you're teaching, you're providing them with that opportunity to fail, but also at the same time, there is a learning curve there as well. Is that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's sort of like a dilemma that I have to navigate. I know some of my students are really focused on wanting to learn how to code right and really like adhere to the rules, read a lot of stuff about how you organize and structure your code, know about different like data structures and such before they take the plunge and actually write some code. Whereas I think the whole way that creative coding is structured now is much more like do something, like goof around, hack, tinker, botch, break stuff. Even if it fails miserably, then just revert back to a previous sketch and then just start experimenting again. And I think it's very much a task that I have. I think an obligation as a teacher to build sort of like a safe environment in my creative coding course as that allows my students to fail and not be ashamed of screwing things up or having a screen full of code that won't compile. It's all part of the process. And I think
really, what you're outlining there is kind of some level of that expression, I don't know, imposter syndrome, where you don't really feel like I would feel somewhat uncomfortable being in a coding creative class because I'm not traditionally taught in that way. But I think how you're framing it is as a safe space.
Yes.
You don't need to have that kind of very intellectual, mathematical kind of background. You're inviting young creatives in to do that experiment and learn through that experimentation and that play.
Absolutely. And I think that the only thing that I'm asking of people in advance is actually that they're curious. They want to see what this is all about. And I mean, they're theoretically free to leave if they don't really feel that it appeals to them. I mean, theoretically, because the way that we've structured the courses at DMJX, where I teach, is actually that it's mandatory. You can't just abandon the course. But I really try my best to tell people in advance that yes, just come in and be curious, and we'll explore this together. I teach a lot of like introductory courses, and recently we've seen an influx of students with at least a mathematical background and an understanding of how logic works. Because we've just 2 years ago launched this coded design program, which like focuses specifically on teaching a graphic design curriculum through code. So some of the students that we get for this particular program, they have a background in math and logic and natural sciences.
Wow. I'll share a secret and then ask you another little question. So I was at Coca-Cola for a minute, and the designer of the Coca-Cola logo, the original designer, 130 years ago, was the bookkeeper, the financial accountant of the founder. So potentially one of the most famous logos, iconic logos in the world, was designed by a mathematician, accountant, bookkeeper. So there's definitely room for all of us in our creative world. But speaking of clients, and because I was client side for a while, most clients want a logo, right? They want a design. They want an identity system. They don't want an algorithm. So how does, and that's a very narrow-minded point of view, but I can tell you from being client side, they have a deliverable. And so the world that you are creating and teaching in is probably for many clients or brands quite confusing, or like the lack of understanding. How could you explain to a brand that they may need both? Yes, they need a logo and a design system, but actually, what you're creating and what you're teaching could also be very useful for brands as well.
Yes, absolutely. Immensely useful. I think the transition and the paradigm shift that we've seen the past couple of decades is the transitioning from like things being very much static into things that are really like dynamic. And we don't rarely anymore have like a fixed format. Everything is in flux. The logos, the identities that you develop have to be shown on like tiny screens on a smartwatch up to like big murals in the city space and everything in between. Landscape format, portrait format, all of these things. And like if you don't want to drown yourself in manually crafting all of these different versions of your identity, then it makes perfect sense to look into looking at how you can design a brand identity as something that has, aside from like the visuals and the assets, it built into it some sort of like inherent logic that will make it possible for you to just ask the system what you need, and it'll sort of like build it on its own, like as if by pure magic. And I think is if well, I can't blame clients that they're not aware of this, because I think that's not an obligation that clients uh, should have to, be at the forefront of what's actually possible. I think it falls to it's a task that falls on the agencies, on my students when they graduate, and me as a teacher as well, to try to push the boundaries of what's possible and try to, well, graphic design has sort of like for some a very like old ring to it. It's something that people would associate with a different era. But then again, I think graphic design and the word itself holds a lot of like positive connotations. I think we should strive to kind of like really make graphic design be contemporary, and try to show people what modern graphic design is. And I would probably claim that design has always been a systemic undertaking. It has always involved, well, old school brand books. They had the rules, you had to make them, you had to play by the rules. Uh, but nowadays, all of these things are just built into the system. And I really think that, for some of my students that play around with this for the first time, once they see how they can translate this logic into code, put it into a simple sketch, and then have this little tiny program that can just generate thousands of different comps in literally a split second. It's like when the penny drops. It's like when they really see the value of this. And I think it's just a matter of showing clients and showing brands that this is actually possible. And
Do,
of
do
course,
clients look for that efficiency, as you mentioned there, just like dozens of comps, like changing the proportions of the typography or the color palette quickly on a piece of packaging, which is almost real time. Is that a creative kind of proposition to a client, or an efficiency sort of a design production proposition in the way you see it?
both, I'd say. Definitely. If you want to go with the story about efficiency, well, brands, clients understand that from kind of like an economical perspective. But again, I think what these tools, be them really like very polished or very rudimentary or very crude, they also invite clients and brands into the creative process. They become sort of like co-creators. Like on several occasions, I've made super simple tools as part of my own process that I've then given to a client and said, play around with this, see what you can make. And then, take a note of the different settings, or even like export that in a little JSON file. And then, when they come back to me and tell me, okay, we've used this little tool to come up with these different things that we find appealing. Okay, I can just take these settings and I can like iterate on them and improve them, and sort of become much more of a dialogue where they take an active part. It's not just me coming with a bunch of proposals on pasted up on a piece of a board, and then ask them to choose which one they like best. It's really like becoming a really rewarding way of working with clients that I think the client as well appreciate, from a creative point of view, feeling they have an agency, feeling that they have ownership, feeling that they have played an active part in coming up with what eventually goes out on packaging or posters.
Reminds me of, in a way, the sort of variable font kind of stretch, and so we all used to buy fonts, and there'd be 3 or 4 weights, or maybe an extended family, and now it's almost kind of endless. And the way that a brand can show up in a more dynamic way versus it being a logo stroke sticker that is the same on everything. And of course that breeds an element of consistency in brands like that. But at the same time, the devices, the touch points, the physical and the digital, it means that a brand as a brand story needs to show up in context of the environment that it's been placed on, and what you're probably creating allows brands to be able, but still have a consistent thread, but be almost designed for purpose.
Absolutely. And also, I think brands nowadays is not just, as you say, a sticker on a packaging. It's much more of an experience. It's much more of like you engage with the brand in different ways, playful ways, and sometimes you often see in like shopping malls or city centers, or like installations that brands have put up as part of course, obviously, as a piece of promotional thing. But it's, well, revolving around you as a spectator or the audience engaging and playing with the logo or the brand itself, right? Pushing, kicking, shouting at it, having some sort of like an interaction with the brand. It's just not sitting there communicating at you, it's actually playing with you. So I think a lot of clients and brands really want to look into this way of having brands that exist as something that can sense the environment, I should say, something that can take a note of how people use it, play with it, and generally just be a brand that is a little bit more alive than just something that is static in the lower right corner, right?
Oh, for sure. Again, my stories at Coke, I think we would think that the brand belongs to the people in many ways. Obviously, clearly it does not financially, but in terms of ownership and the longevity, we're just stewards of the brand for a set number of years, but it's actually part of popular culture, part of history. And I think a lot of brands, the successful brands, have sort of navigated and been able to place themselves into our lives like that. There's a couple of words that you've used that I'm glad that you're still using the terminology, graphic design, because I'm definitely older than you, but we're from a similar era when graphic design was graphic design, and I feel graphic design is a bit like rock and roll. It doesn't mean to say we're Elvis and we're from the 50s and 60s, but the fact that you are now redefining what traditional graphic design is. So my question on the back of that is that an intentional use of a word that's been around probably all our lives, and you're helping to carry that definition forward now, but in the context of how you're teaching through code?
Yes, absolutely. It's very much done on purpose. I think a lot of other creative coders and people generally working with advertising and visual design are probably more accustomed nowadays to refer to it as like visual communication and such. But I think for me, at least, like communication, yes, it's something that transfers information from one source to another. Whereas I think design sort of like hints at an intention, a purpose. Someone has designed something for others to see. So I really like the part of graphic design that points or aims at this intentional act of creation. Whereas just I think visual communication, while it may be correct in many senses, I think it's a little bit more like bland, or a little bit more like unemotional. I really also, because I think like graphic design has a legacy, and it's centuries old, and it's something that has always been extended and redefined, and it's always had a really strong relationship with technology. Even back in the days when things were analog, graphic designers were really keen on looking into new technology and see what they could use it for to come up with new visual designs. And I think part of that, um, the designer as a creator, went lost back at the desktop revolution in the mid 80s, because at the point where we transitioned from analog to digital, something really important got lost. A lot of graphic designers in the analog days, they had their hands and they had the knowledge of all things tangible, how to sculpt, how to make tools with their own hands. And all of a sudden, things became digital. And no graphic designers were programmers, and they had no ability to continue to be craftsmen or make their own tools. So the designer as a tool maker got lost in the 1980s, and it's so pleasing for me to see that this little spark of a revolution that came back in in the 2000s, um, with things like, well, Flash, obviously, Macromedia Director, and then later on JavaScript, and we've seen processing and such, and it's kind of like exploded. And all of a sudden, we now have generations of designers that have all of these wonderful tools at their disposal, and they're really like curious to look into how they can use them to become like digital tool makers, and to sort of like reclaim some of that got lost back in like the 1980s. Um, so I really think like from graphic design and the idea of a graphic designer as a tool maker, I really see that nowadays we have the ability to really pursue and to own that, uh, yeah, that idea of craftsmanship again.
It's interesting because today a traditional graphic designer is definitely not from that sort of analog world. It's probably from the late 80s, rolling into the 90s, 2000, when obviously desktop publishing, as we originally, named it. And so even you've gone back even a step further to when life was all, done by hand, cut and paste, traditional drawing boards, etc. If you were, effectively sat on a plane or sat on a train next to a traditional graphic designer of today, who's, sort of in their mid-career, if you like, wherever that number falls, and they are more used to, Photoshop. Maybe they go back as freehand and Illustrator, of course, and, let's call that the traditional graphic designer of today. And they were somewhat resistant to sort of step out of their traditional comfort zone. What type of conversation would you have? How would you even sort of, if someone was trying to not necessarily resist, but certainly, how would you coach a more traditional designer to take a peek at creative coding?
Yeah, great question. Um, I think I would probably start by asking them, well, obviously most designers nowadays knows their way around Photoshop. Just take a look at the tool palette and just take a look at how all of these like representations of the icons are remediations of analog tools. Like we've even got this little smearing hand, we've got a pen, we've got a ruler. All of these things originate and date back to things that when they were analog. So it's actually Photoshop is just a big digital remake or remediation of the analog tools, right? And obviously now Photoshop has evolved into something that is much more than that. But the original versions of Photoshop were just that. Now we've seen obviously AI being embedded into all of these, like the design suites that most graphic designers use today. So I would probably also have a little conversation about AI and how they use AI. And then I would probably end up offering them a little bit of more like a glimpse into something that could hopefully aspire them to look into coding, namely the idea that they have, as graphic designers, also the responsibility for giving back to the discipline itself by being curious and trying to push it forward. Because if we don't have graphic designers that try to push things forward, things will just stagnate. So if you want to be at the forefront and if you want to look into something that can be a new way of working, new visual aesthetics to explore, I would probably say that if you look into working with code and algorithms, and now we're tracing back to what we previously talked about math. I think if you open that treasure trove of algorithms and maths and formulas, you can, and computation, through code, you can actually unlock a totally new level of aesthetics that have been right up till now almost been unexplored. And you can take your visions and idea of what graphic design can be much further than you would ever could in some of the like third-party de facto software that the industry uses. And also, of course, again, being a craftsman, you can write your own tools. You can literally claim that you can do something that is unique because nobody else in the world has access to the tools that you have just written for yourself, right? Everybody's got access to Photoshop. Everybody can just trace your steps back and they can do the exact same thing. So if you want to be truly original, you should start learning to code.
I like the thought of you blending them. Is there anything, I wouldn't call it, is there a design tool, design software, maybe a font that, you know, comes from that more traditional world of our last 20, 30 years of being a creative professional that you still like to use? So, you know, maybe blended with creative coding, and that could be, you know, as I say, it could be a typeface. It could be, you know, it's almost like a secret shame. But I still, because I still use this and I still enjoy using it. Is there anything in that world that you're still passionate about?
Yeah, great question. No, I'm probably more like some of the more invisible things. Some of the ways that you work with, I think, well, okay, obviously not that invisible anyway. So some of them may be underlying structure or the way that you choose to sort of like place layout on a page or try to create this imbalance or try to create interesting layouts and such. It's very much like this like tacit knowledge that I have been taught by hand from the designer that I was an apprentice to. But of course, these can also, if you look into it, be formalized as some sort of like a principles that can then be transferred over to code. But I think some of the things that I think Paul Rand named as the language of form, and he was hinting at 7 or 8 different things like tension, contrast, rhythm, repetition, all of these things, scale. I constantly use them, and these were things that I really used on an everyday basis without even being aware of it back when I was working as an apprentice in a printing agency. But they hold very much true to this day, where I have, well, sort of like shifted gears totally and now working fully with designing with code. But I still use these principles, absolutely.
Great. So maybe not Comic Sans, but the foundational principles that are probably 1,000 years old as well, right? In terms of, you know, good design and nature being the best designer of all time, and how those principles still carry forward. In terms of ideas and just your, you know, where do your best idea, what, maybe not where, but what, are there certain times of the day, like middle of the night, I don't know, right, driving, in the shower, are there certain moments that you've noticed that you are definitely on fire creatively, and you just kind of like feel the energy happening for yourself?
Yes, very specific, 2 places. One of them, I think I share with a lot of other people, is actually in the shower. because being a family man and having kids, having wife, having until recently also a cat that I had to take care of, is like whenever I'm in the middle of my house, it's just like people are always asking me for things and yeah, having to point my attention in different directions. And of course I do that. But in the showers, it's much more like I can just focus and being like undisturbed at least as long as I'm showering, right? So I have, I think, the mental space and the idea that I will not be disturbed when I'm showering, and I think that is what really like is the spark, because then ideas sort of like pop up in my head, and I've on numerous occasions I've actually had some sort of like a brainwave in the shower, or really like I've been struggling for a couple of days with trying to solve something algorithmically, and then in the middle of a shower, then oh, there it is. At one point, I even had to like try to jot my thoughts down on like this damp mirror, and then to really like trying to frantically get dressed and get in and rush to get my camera and take a snapshot of my like finger doodles on the mirror, right? And the other place is on my daily commute. I have approximately half an hour from where I live to where I work. And I think that like two times half an hour a day on the journey in and on the journey back, I sort of like have agreed with myself. I have this dogma that I'm not going to open my company's inbox. I'm not going to answer emails. I'm not going to do phone calls. Like I will totally devote these 30 minutes to myself and to my code doodles and sketches. And that's a time I really value, and I really strive to keep that time undisturbed.
That's great. I mean, both of them, I suppose in the future, there might be a self-driving vehicle with a shower in it, right? So you can sort of almost kind of enjoy both of those at the same time. But speaking of technology, and the obvious question that I'd love to ask somebody like you, as everybody's asking ourselves every day, but where do you stand then on the AI tsunami that has, and because creative coding has been around a fair amount of time now, and then all of a sudden in comes AI, like move over everybody. AI is here, and it's almost like the daddy's just arrived. Like, do you? And aside from robots taking our jobs and that sort of negative, when you teach your students, you talk about the kind of crossover between graphic design, creative coding, AI, traditional tools, traditional techniques from 100 years ago. What's your position, and how do you sort of frame to the young generation coming in as the next generation of designers on AI in the context of everything else that you've learned?
That's a big question, yeah. But I think I'm not thinking AI is gonna go away. Obviously, it's here, and it's here for good. And I think we will probably just see more of this like AI tsunami, as you refer to it. But I think it's a matter of working intelligently with AI. Definitely, AI can be a super valuable co-creator. My problem with AI is that if students try to replace their own ideas of trying to not being able to come up with something themselves, they just prompt away. I think that's problematic. I think it's not there to replace graphic designers, it's there to augment. Uh, so probably, I encourage my students to actively use AI. The school, DMJX, where I teach, has taken an active stance on towards AI, saying that it's here, and we sort of like encourage our students to work with it. But we also try to provide some guidelines and some guardrails, and really try to ask them to reflect on how they work with AI. But I think it's in the end, I see AI as something that is there to help us, but it's not there to replace us. And I base that perspective on a number of observations that I've made, namely that Back in the 1980s, there was this like first surge of artificial intelligence, but it was like expert systems. And they had this rather naive idea of if we could just feed a system all the rules that were in a discipline, it would know everything about graphic design. And obviously, this was not the case. And they failed miserably back in the 80s, also because of like lack of computing power. Uh, and it's sort of like went stale for a number of decades, but then we recently saw this like surge in computer power, and all of a sudden now a modern AI is a possibility. But these two, they represent like the 80s was really like a deductive way of working. It was like rule-based AI, right? Nowadays, we see all of these like AIs being trained with huge data sets, and it's more like data-driven. It's more like inductive. Show them a number of like different outcomes, and it's sort of like builds an idea of what the rules is, but it's sort of like fuzzy, and it's black box. But usually when people discuss this, they have this idea of something being deductive and inductive, but there's actually like a third layer, and it's called like the abductive way of thinking, or even like the abductive approach to design. And what that represents, it's a much more like human-centered perspective. It's something where you, as a designer, is using your empathy, your intuition, your idea of the world around you, all of these like social constructs that you're aware of, moral ethics, all of these things, and you probably approach design as problem framing and problem solving. And part of problem solving is also outsourcing some of the more like tedious and laborious work to an AI through deductive and through inductive practices. And I think the less mundane task that we're really bored of as designers, I think we should definitely outsource those to an AI, and they can help us traverse huge like solution spaces, and we can cherry pick whatever we see. It can help us along in an idea generation phase and such. But eventually, I think as designers, we should always let the outcome of these AIs, be them deductive or inductive, pass through some sort of like a disciplinary expertise filter to sort of like weed out the bad ones and keep the good ones. And I think that my main problem with AI and how it's sort of like really taken over everything today is that it's just a simple one-click solution for people with no knowledge of visual communication, graphic design, call it what you want. But all of these like ways that we have communicated through centuries, that they don't know everything about that, but they sort of like mistake the outcome of an AI of something that looks to be effective or looks to be modern design. But I think as practitioners, as professionals in a field, we can easily point out all the weak spots that the things that AI has produced with an unintelligent prompt, right? So I think the AI is there. It's going to be there. It's probably, if we are not really keen on keeping a professional level of visual communication and graphic design, it's just going to erode the notion of quality. What is quality? What constitutes quality in terms of like graphic design? So I think it's important more now than ever in the times of AI, as like graphic designers, visual communicators, coders alike, to really like stand strong on a disciplinary foundation and to really like try to enforce these rules that have been honed through, yeah, long time. Oh, quite a long-winded answer. Sorry. You tapped into
Well, I
something
mean,
that was really important to me there.
you're right. It's such a big monster question and topic, and sort of but all the more reason because again you mentioned it several times to keep hold and reinvent and keep championing the notion of graphic design, and that AI is just a sort of another tool that's joined the party, from from scalpels and spray mount to desktop publishing, another reference you made earlier, when everybody could design a poster then because desktop publishing and Apple Macintosh, when it landed, allowed us to. But then obviously, that moves away and the professionals kind of rise to the top. So final question, because we've spoken, this has been great. I've really enjoyed it as well, Stig. But I didn't, we're at 50 minutes and I wanted to sort of finish on that classic, because I get asked sometimes. I live in an area, a wonderful area. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and a lot of my neighbors and friends are in real estate or finance. And, imagine yourself at the dinner table and I'm like the graphic designer. So if you're in Denmark, you're going for dinner, you're meeting a few strangers that you don't know, and somebody says, so tell me a bit about yourself. How do you articulate such a, not a complex world, but such a sort of an unknown kind of world of creative coding and all your background? How do you articulate that to someone who has never met you in a sort of in that conversational context?
Yeah, how do I do that?
Well, first let me help. Firstly, you're a teacher, so that's the easy bit. But then I guess okay. So the next question would be at dinner. Oh, great, Steve. What do you teach? So that's kind of the crux of the question.
Yeah, I teach graphic design to students. I teach them how to use code as a creative medium to express themselves on digital platforms. I teach them how to communicate visually. I teach them how to use the technology and all of the computation power that we have surrounding us in a modern society creatively for good, to communicate to people in a playful, engaging, and visually contemporary way. I'm obviously not, and then they would go, yeah, I see, and then they would turn to the person next to them and ask them the same question. No,
maybe that happens to me a lot anyway. But yeah.
I could probably,
I'd be the same. I'm a graphic designer. I'm a storyteller. They're like, okay, I'll go find someone else in the kitchen. But it's often a challenge in a way to define, what our job description is. That's the kind of the name on the business card and our title. But certainly then clicking down below that, and what you're doing in my sort of little wrap up to thank you. But what you're doing is defining that next generation of graphic designers, but not losing sight of the history, the traditional tools, if you like, and everything that you've been using since you were at college and at university studying design, and carrying that forward, but at the same time being open to explore new ways, make mistakes, but actually learn from the creative coding, and AI will come and join that party as well, and we'll embrace that as a new tool. So I think that's my real takeaway, that if anybody's listening, there's just this understanding of the next generation of graphic designers using this code to express ideas in a way that maybe traditionally we've not been doing, in our workplace. So Stig, I want to say a big thank you for sharing your journey, your stories, your insights. For everybody who's listening here, I found it really, really fascinating, and I'm really pleased that you decided to join us.
Well, thank you again for having me, and I really thoroughly enjoyed our conversation as well. So yes, again, thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, and thanks for everyone listening. All right, I'm still recording, but I'm going to press stop now, Stig, and just the guys will just trim all that off.
Perfect.
Brilliant. We've stopped recording.